The dust was a shroud, and the silence a tomb. Elias Vance lived inside both. His ranch was a constellation of memories, each fence post a testament to a hand that no longer held his, each gust of wind a whisper of a name he no longer dared to speak aloud. Sarah. The house stood hollowed out by her absence, the small nursery a sealed-up wound in the heart of it. For 2 years, grief had been his only companion, a merciless foreman driving him through the same rituals day after day. He would rise before the sun, work until his muscles screamed louder than his thoughts, and fall into a dreamless sleep born of exhaustion, not peace. The world outside his blighted patch of land had ceased to exist. It was a distant rumor, a place where other people lived lives he could no longer comprehend. But the salt pork was gone, and the flour sack was little more than a dusty ghost. The town, a necessary evil, beckoned. He rode his horse, Job, with the grim resignation of a man walking to his own gallows. The town of redemption was a lie pressed into the cracked earth, a place of hard men and harder bargains. Sunlight didn't seem to warm it, only bleach the life from it. He tied Job to the hitching post outside the general store, his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the gazes of others, refusing any connection that might disturb the careful architecture of his solitude. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of leather and dried beans. He gathered his supplies with practiced efficiency, his movements economical, his face a mask of stone. It was on his way out, his saddlebags laden, that a sound snagged in the fabric of his quiet despair. It was a snarl, thin and desperate, like a coyote pup cornered and starving. It came from the alley between the saloon and the blacksmith's forge, a sliver of shadow choked with refuse and neglect. Elias was a man who had perfected the art of walking away. He had walked away from his neighbors, from the church, from the very idea of a future. But he did not walk away this time. He stopped. He turned. He looked. What he saw was not a coyote pup. It was 3 children, caked in grime so thick it was like a second skin. They were a tangle of sharp elbows and fierce, haunted eyes, fighting over a half-eaten apple core someone had tossed into the filth. The eldest, a boy of maybe 12, had the others pinned back with the ferocity of a wolf defending its territory. He held the core in his fist, his knuckles white, his chest heaving. A girl, younger, with hair the color of straw and eyes too old for her face, watched him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The smallest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, was weeping silently, his small body trembling. They were feral things, creatures of instinct and survival, their humanity stripped away by a cruelty Elias could feel like a physical chill. The world had broken them. He knew the feeling. He saw his own reflection in their sunken cheeks and bottomless eyes. The world had taught Elias that tenderness was a liability, a weakness that led only to ruin. And yet, he moved. Not toward them, for he knew that would scatter them like quail. He walked back into the general store, the bell above the door jangling a note of discord in the afternoon stillness. He bought a full loaf of fresh bread, still warm from the oven. The scent filled his nostrils, a memory of a different life, of Sarah humming in their kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. He pushed the memory down, a familiar and painful reflex. Back outside, he approached the alley's mouth. The children froze, their small, desperate drama suspended. The oldest boy pushed the other 2 behind him, his body a frail but determined shield. Elias saw the terror in his eyes, but also a challenge, a raw defiance that resonated with the hard, unbroken part of his own soul. He didn't speak. Words were useless things, clumsy and false. Instead, he placed the loaf of bread on an overturned crate just inside the alley, a silent offering. He held their gaze for a long moment, a trinity of fear looking back at him, before he turned his back and walked to his horse. He untied the reins, swung himself into the saddle, and rode out of town without a backward glance. But he could feel their eyes on his back the entire way, a weight heavier than any steel bag. The ride home was different. The silence of the plains was no longer empty, it was filled with the image of 3 small, hungry faces. The carefully constructed walls of his grief had been breached. That night, a storm rolled in, a torrent of wind and rain that lashed against the house. As he sat staring into the fire, a noise from the barn cut through the howl of the wind. It wasn't the sound of a horse or the skittering of a rat. It was the sound of a child's cough, small and weak. He pulled on his coat, lit a lantern, and walked into the maelstrom. There, huddled in the far corner of the barn, burrowed into a pile of old hay for warmth, were the 3 children. They had followed him. They had chosen his desolation over the world's indifference. They stared up at him, their faces illuminated in the flickering lantern light, not like strays, but like pilgrims who had reached a strange and uncertain sanctuary. The children remained in the barn for 3 days. It was an unspoken, fragile truce. Elias would leave a pail of fresh milk and a plate of biscuits on a hay bale in the morning, and it would be gone by noon. He worked his chores with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, never looking directly at the corner where they hid, granting them the dignity of their fear. He was a man accustomed to the language of wounded animals, and he knew that trust was not a thing to be demanded, but a thing to be earned, inch by painful inch. He could feel their eyes on him as he mended a section of fence, their silent observation a constant presence. The oldest, the boy he would come to know as Leo, was a sentinel. He never seemed to sleep, his gaze sharp and suspicious, always positioned between Elias and his younger siblings. The girl, Eliza, was a ghost. She would flit at the edges of his vision, a whisper of movement, her stillness more profound than any sound. The little one, Ben, was the most curious, his small head sometimes peeking over the edge of the hayloft, his eyes wide with a child's wonder that had not yet been entirely extinguished. On the 4th day, the sky, which had been a merciless, brilliant blue, turned the color of slate. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and a deep, resonant chill. The storm broke with a fury that seemed biblical, the rain coming down in sheets that turned the dusty yard into a roiling sea of mud. The old barn groaned under the assault, water seeping through the roof, dripping onto the hay where the children huddled. Elias stood on his porch, watching the deluge, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought of them out there, cold and wet, and the thought was a splinter under his thumbnail, a small but persistent pain. He could not leave them. The realization was not a choice, it was a simple, immutable fact. He grabbed the lantern again and strode through the downpour to the barn. The door creaked open, and he found them pressed together, shivering, their clothes soaked through. Leo stood up, placing his small body in front of the others, his face a mask of defiant terror. Elias didn't speak. He simply stood there, the lantern held high, and then he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the door open behind him. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He trusted the cold to do his convincing. Inside, he led them not to the main living space, but to the spare room at the back of the house, a room that held no ghosts. He laid out 3 thick wool blankets on the floor and pointed to the hearth in the main room, where the fire blazed. "Dry off," he said. The 2 words felt strange in his throat, rough from disuse. He left them, retreating to his own chair, giving them space. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside, a new kind of quiet settled. It was not the hollow silence of grief, but a silence brimming with unspoken things, with fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Slowly, tentatively, they emerged from the room and huddled near the fire, wrapped in their blankets, looking like small, weary monks. Elias pretended to read a book, but he watched them from the corner of his eye. He saw the tension in Leo's shoulders, the way Eliza's hands trembled as she held them out to the warmth, the way Ben's eyelids drooped with exhaustion. He rose and ladled 3 bowls of the stew he had made for himself, placing them on the floor near them without a word. They ate ravenously, their hunger a raw, desperate thing. The days that followed found a new rhythm. They were no longer barn cats, but quiet shadows within the house itself. Elias never asked their names, and they never offered them. He learned them through observation. He heard Eliza whisper Leo when her brother gave her his share of the bread. He heard Leo murmur Ben when the smallest boy stumbled. And so they were Leo, Eliza, and Ben. A family of broken pieces. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch oiling a leather bridle, Elias found himself reaching for a block of pine he kept for kindling. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, began to move with a forgotten grace. He whittled. The knife shaved away the wood, and from it emerged the shape of a small bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He had carved dozens of these for his son, Samuel. The muscle memory was still there, a phantom limb of his old life. When it was finished, smooth and perfect in his palm, a wave of the old grief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He placed the wooden bird on the porch railing and walked away, needing the hard labor of the fields to chase the ghosts back into their cages. The next morning, the bird was gone. From the kitchen window, he saw Ben sitting in the dirt near the water trough, clutching the small carving in his hand, his thumb stroking its smooth wooden back. It was the first time Elias had allowed a piece of his past to touch this new, uncertain present. The two worlds had collided, not with a crash, but with the quiet touch of a child's hand on a father's forgotten creation. He felt a crack in the frozen shell around his heart, a painful, terrifying thaw. And far away, in the town of Redemption, a man with eyes like chips of flint and a cruel twist to his mouth dismounted from his horse. He strode into the sheriff's office, his spurs ringing on the floorboards, a smug confidence in his step. He was asking questions. Questions about 3 stray children. A month bled into the next, and the harsh lines of the landscape began to soften with the promise of spring. The quiet on the ranch changed, too. It was no longer a marker of absence but a comfortable space filled with the small sounds of life. The scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft thud of Ben's wooden bird falling to the floor, the rustle of Eliza turning a page in one of Sarah's old books she had discovered in a chest. She couldn't read the words, but she would trace the letters with her finger, her expression one of intense concentration. They were healing, like sun-starved plants turning toward a reluctant light. Leo's shoulders were not so perpetually hunched, the suspicion in his eyes sometimes replaced by a watchful curiosity. He would follow Elias on his rounds, observing how he mended the fence, how he calmed a nervous horse, his silence a form of apprenticeship. Eliza, in turn, began to tend to the house. She would sweep the porch with a quiet diligence, or fold the blankets each morning into neat squares, her small acts an attempt to impose order on a world that had only ever shown her chaos. Elias found a clean, mended dress of Sarah's, one she had worn as a girl, and left it on Eliza's blanket. The next day, she wore it, the faded blue a stark contrast to her solemn face, but she stood a little taller in it. The change in Elias was less visible but more profound. The gnawing emptiness in his chest had not vanished, but it now had company. A burgeoning sense of purpose, of responsibility, had taken root in the barren soil of his grief. He found himself speaking more, not in conversations, but in simple, declarative statements. Fence needs mending, the sky looks like rain, more wood for the fire. They were anchors, small points of connection in the vast sea of their shared silence. One evening, the air was still and cool. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Elias sat in his armchair, staring into the flames, lost in a familiar reverie of a life that was no more. He was so deep in his thoughts that he didn't hear the soft padding of small feet on the wooden floor. He only registered the presence when a small, warm weight settled on the floor beside his boot. It was Ben. The boy had curled up on the bearskin rug, his head resting against Elias's leg, his breathing soft and even. Elias froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It was an intimacy he hadn't experienced in years, a physical contact that felt both alien and achingly familiar. He looked down at the boy's head, at the whirl of his dirty blonde hair, and his heart hammered against his ribs. Ben stirred in his half-sleep, nuzzling closer to the warmth. And then he whispered it, a single word, breathed into the stillness of the room, a word that shattered Elias's world. Papa. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration from the simple, trusting heart of a child. The word struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It ripped through the scar tissue of his grief, laying the old wound bare. It was the name his own son had never had the chance to speak. A strangled sound escaped his throat, and for the first time in 2 years, a tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He did not move. He did not speak. He just sat there, paralyzed by the enormity of that one small word, as the boy slept peacefully at his feet. The fragile peace was shattered the following afternoon. The sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Elias looked up from the harness he was repairing and saw two riders. One was Sheriff Miller, his face set in its usual expression of bored indifference. The other was a stranger, a man with a narrow face and a smug, proprietary air. He was dressed in clothes too fine for the trail, and he surveyed the ranch as if he were pricing it for sale. Elias's gut tightened. He knew, with a certainty that was cold and sharp, that the world had come to reclaim what it had abandoned. He rose slowly as they dismounted. Ben, who had been playing nearby, saw the strangers and scurried behind Elias's legs, clutching his trousers. Leo and Eliza appeared in the doorway of the house, their faces pale, their old fear returning like a sudden fever. "Vance," the sheriff said, his tone flat. "This here is Silas Croft." "He's come looking for his property." Croft smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his face. "Not property, Sheriff. My stepchildren. Strays I've been tracking for months." He looked past Elias, his gaze falling on the children in the doorway. "Leo. Eliza. You've caused me a great deal of trouble." His voice was smooth, but with an undercurrent of menace that made the air grow cold. Leo stepped forward, pushing Eliza behind him, his small frame rigid with hatred. "You ain't our kin," he spat, his voice trembling. Croft chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The law says different, boy." He produced a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and held it out. "Guardianship papers. Signed and sealed by a judge. They belong to me." Elias looked at the paper, then back at Croft's smug face. He saw the lie in the man's eyes, the deep, rotten core of his soul. He thought of the scars he'd glimpsed on Leo's back when the boy had been washing at the trough, old scars shaped like a buckle. He thought of Eliza's perpetual flinching, of Ben's nightmares. "They ain't property," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Croft's eyes narrowed. "They're my legal responsibility. And I mean to have them back." Sheriff Miller shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but bound by the paper in Croft's hand. "Look, Vance," he said, his voice taking on a bureaucratic, condescending tone. "The man has a legal claim. I don't like it any more than you do, but the law's the law. You've got 2 days. Have them ready. I'll come back for them myself." "Don't make this difficult." Miller tipped his hat and turned his horse, leaving Croft standing there, his triumphant smile a venomous wound on the face of the day. Croft gave Elias one last, lingering look of contempt before mounting up and following the sheriff. They rode away, leaving behind a silence more terrible than any before it, a silence filled with the ticking clock of a final, terrible countdown. The 2 days that followed were a waking nightmare. The fragile trust that had been so painstakingly built crumbled into dust, replaced by the raw, primal terror of the children's past. The house, which had started to feel like a home, reverted to being a temporary shelter, its walls echoing with a suffocating dread. Ben no longer played with his wooden bird, he clutched it like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. Eliza retreated into her ghostly silence, her eyes wide and vacant, her new dress looking like a cruel mockery of a childhood she was about to lose again. They were back in the alley, starving and cornered, and Elias could see it in every line of their bodies. The second evening, as Elias sat cleaning his rifle on the porch, his movements deliberate and methodical, Leo approached him. The boy stood before him, his jaw set, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked Elias straight in the eye, his gaze filled with an accusation that was almost too much to bear. "You going to sell us again?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The words again hung in the air, a testament to a betrayal so profound Elias could feel its phantom sting. He stopped his work, laying the cleaning rag aside. He met the boy's gaze and held it, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. He thought of the empty nursery, of the life he had lost, and of the 3 desperate lives he had found. The choice was no choice at all. "No," Elias said. The word was not loud, but it had the finality of a rock slide, the certainty of the sunrise. It was a promise. A vow. It was everything. Leo stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of deceit. He found none. He gave a single, sharp nod and walked back into the house, his duty as interrogator complete. Elias did not spend the remaining time packing a small bag for the children. He spent it preparing. He checked the hinges on the doors and the latches on the windows. He sharpened the axe by the woodpile until its edge gleamed. He walked the perimeter of his land, his rifle in hand, his senses alert, reacquainting himself with every rock and ravine, every potential point of defense. Each action was a prayer, a declaration of intent. He was no longer just mending a fence, he was fortifying a home. He was building a wall not of wood and stone, but of sheer will. He sought out each child, a silent farewell to the fear that had defined them. He found Eliza by the window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape. He gently, wordlessly, tucked a stray piece of her straw-colored hair behind her ear. It was a simple, paternal gesture, a ghost of 1,000 such moments with a wife he'd lost, now resurrected for a daughter he was refusing to surrender. She didn't flinch. For the first time, she did not flinch. He found Ben huddled in the corner of the spare room. Elias sat on the floor beside him, saying nothing. After a long silence, the boy's small hand crept into his large, calloused one. Elias wrapped his fingers around it, the warmth a fragile anchor in the storm. The night before Croft was due, Elias sat on the porch swing, his rifle resting across his lap. The moon was a sliver in a black, star-dusted sky. The wind whispered through the eaves, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He thought of Sarah and Samuel, but the memory was different now. The hollow ache was still there, a permanent part of his soul's topography, but it was no longer a void. It was filled with a fierce, protective love for the 3 souls sleeping inside the house. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he refused to lose. He was protecting not just them, but the flicker of his own humanity they had rekindled. He was choosing to fight, choosing to live, choosing to be a father again. The dawn broke grey and sullen, the sun obscured by a low, bruised-looking bank of clouds. The air was heavy, pregnant with violence. He watched the horizon. Around mid-morning, he saw them. 3 riders, not 2. Croft was in the lead, but he was flanked by 2 rough-looking men, hired muscle with dead eyes and cruel mouths. The sheriff was not with them. Croft had decided to forego the pretense of the law. He wasn't here to collect his property, he was here to take it, and to punish the man who had dared to stand in his way. Elias stood up, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He stepped off the porch and waited in the yard, a solitary figure standing between a house full of fear and a world full of men like Silas Croft. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his boots. The battle for redemption was about to begin, not in the town that bore its name, but right here, in the heart of a broken man's last stand. The 3 riders pulled up just beyond the mended fence line, their horses stamping impatiently. Silas Croft's face was a mask of smug satisfaction, the face of a man who believed the world was his to take. "Vance," he shouted, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "I've come for what's mine. Send them out now, and I'll forget you were ever stupid enough to harbor them." His 2 hired thugs grinned, shifting in their saddles, their hands resting near their sidearms. Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, a granite statue of defiance, his rifle held at his side. His silence was more infuriating to Croft than any argument. "Have it your way," Croft sneered, dismounting. He uncoiled a bullwhip from his saddle, the leather snake slithering in his grip. "I was going to teach the boy a lesson for running. Now I'll teach you one for interfering." He and his men moved toward the gate. "They are not yours," Elias said, his voice level and cold, carrying a weight that made the thugs hesitate for a fraction of a second. "They are home." The word hung in the air, a declaration of war. Croft laughed. "This pathetic scrap of land? This is a cage. I'm their salvation." He flicked the whip, and its tip cracked the air with a sound like a gunshot, a sound that carried all the terror of the children's past. From the window, Leo watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw Croft's whip, and a memory, hot and sharp, seared through him. The buckle. The dark shed. The reason he had taken his siblings and run. But then he saw Elias, standing unflinching, a lone protector against the tide. He saw the promise from the night before, not just a word, but a posture, a stance, a man willing to die for them. The thug spread out, attempting to flank Elias. Croft advanced through the gate, coiling the whip for another strike. Last chance, old man. Stand aside. Elias raised the rifle, not to his shoulder, but holding it across his body like a barrier. You are not welcome here. The first thug rushed him from the side. Elias moved with a speed that belied his years of quiet grief. He swung the butt of the rifle, catching the man squarely in the jaw with a sickening crack of bone. The man crumpled to the ground, out cold. The second thug drew his pistol, but he was clumsy, overconfident. As he raised the weapon, Elias lunged forward, closing the distance. He wasn't a gunman, he was a rancher. His strength was in his hands, in his body, honed by years of hard labor. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, driving him backward into a fence post. The man's head hit the wood with a dull thud, and he slid to the dirt, his pistol falling from his limp hand. It was just Croft now. His smugness had evaporated, replaced by a venomous rage. He lashed out with the whip, the leather tip catching Elias across the arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a bright red welt. Elias grunted in pain but did not retreat. He saw the faces of the children in his mind, Ben's trusting sleep, Eliza's tentative smile, Leo's defiant gaze. He lunged forward, through the whip's reach, grabbing the leather cord with one hand and yanking Croft off balance. Croft stumbled, his eyes wide with surprise. Elias drove his fist into the man's gut, once, twice. The air rushed out of Croft's lungs. He was not a fighter, just a bully. Without his tools of terror, he was weak. As they struggled, a rock flew through the air and struck Croft hard on the side of the head. It had come from the porch. Leo stood there, his face a mixture of terror and fierce resolution, another rock in his hand. He had chosen his side. He had entered the fray. The distraction was all Elias needed. He wrenched the whip from Croft's hand and threw the man to the ground. He stood over him, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding, his knuckles raw. He looked down at the pathetic, gasping man who viewed children as possessions, who built his own worth on the fear of others. He could have ended him. The rage and grief and fury of 2 years coalesced into a single, burning point. But then he looked toward the house and saw Eliza and Ben peering from the doorway, their faces pale with shock. He was not this man. He was not a killer. He was a father. He let the rage go, the storm inside him passing. He stood back as Croft scrambled to his feet, clutching his head, his eyes wild with hatred and fear. "This ain't over, Vance," he spat, blood trickling from his lip. He stumbled back toward his horse, hauling his dazed men with him, and rode away, a defeated coward disappearing into the dust he came from. The silence that fell was profound. It was the silence of survival, of a battle won. Elias stood for a long moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Then he turned toward the house. Leo was still on the porch, the rock dropped at his feet. Eliza and Ben slowly came out to join him. They didn't run to Elias. They just stood there, watching him. He walked toward them, his body aching, his arm on fire. He knelt down in front of them, bringing himself to their level. He looked at each of them in turn, into the eyes of the family he had just bled for. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe." And in that moment, under the bruised and clearing sky, the 3 broken children and the broken man who had saved them finally, truly, became a family. Weeks later, the land was alive. Green shoots pushed through the hard-packed earth, and the creek ran full and clear. The scars on Elias's arm had faded, and the ones on his heart felt different, less like open wounds and more like the seasoned grain of old, strong wood. He was teaching Leo how to set a fence post, their movements falling into a comfortable, shared rhythm. He would explain, and the boy would listen, his brow furrowed in concentration, no longer a suspicious guard but a son learning his father's work. Near the porch, a small, vibrant patch of wildflowers had appeared, a riot of purple and yellow. Eliza tended to it every morning, her quiet care coaxing life from the soil. One afternoon, a sound, bright and clear as a bell, echoed across the ranch, the sound of Ben laughing as he chased a butterfly. It was the first time such a sound had been heard there, and Elias paused, his hand on the post, and simply listened. He looked at his home, at the mended fence, the blooming flowers, the children who were no longer haunted, but living. The ache for Sarah and Samuel would always be a part of him, a gentle shadow in the brightest sun. But it was no longer an all-consuming void. He had not replaced his loss. He had built something new beside it. He had found his redemption not in forgetting the past, but in fighting for a future. He gave them a home, and they, in turn, had given him a reason to live. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.